Hello, and welcome to this talk on the Edinburgh Boundary Extension of 1920. The theme of this talk is a study of how the boundary extension process was written about in the local, as well as some national newspapers of the time. Firstly, I should introduce myself. My name is Iain, and I work as a library development leader for the Edinburgh and Scottish Collection and the Reference Library, which are two departments within Central Library, which is located on George IV Bridge, Edinburgh. Though the lockdown period has meant a whole lot more working from home than I am normally used to, I feel very lucky that I am usually able to work in such a great building as Central Library and with such fantastic collections, such as the newspaper and image archives, which have helped to produce this talk. The sepia-coloured image that you can see on the left side of the ReDrawing Edinburgh logo is of the former newsroom at Central Library. Though this part of the building has changed quite dramatically since this picture was taken in 1936, I am fairly certain there were not many major architectural or layout changes to Central before this shot. So what you're seeing here is very similar to what someone wanting to find out about an aspect of the boundary extension would have been met with had they gone into Central Library wanting to read the daily papers in 1920. This image can be found, as well as the others that you will see in this talk, via the website Capital Collections, which is well worth visiting for your own research and interest. The ReDrawing Edinburgh logo is there as this talk has been produced to be part of the commemoration of the Boundary Extension Centennial. More on the overall project later. I should say at the outset that for a far more detailed history of the boundary extension topic, please see the talk recorded and presented by Henry Sullivan of Edinburgh City Archives, which went out on Facebook Live a couple of weeks ago and is now available near the top of the Edinburgh City Archives Facebook page. Unlike with that previous talk, which was longer in length and goes into greater detail to answer its central question of why did 1920 happen, the aim here instead is to bring alive some of the voices of the time and show how the boundary change was both reported and received. This being said, there is naturally some overlap of the subject areas of the events and happenings of this talk and the first one, so apologies to those of you who may have covered this ground already. I've grouped the talk together into the following areas to give it structure and to take us broadly through the chronology of events as they happened. Starting off with Greater Edinburgh, a look at the background and run up to the boundary extension period in the years following the First World War. Transport. We will then look at the issues of public transport and discover through the debate what was going on and just how central this issue was to the whole process. LEITH. For all of you wanting to get to the real juicy bits, we will not steer clear from the controversy for too long. LEITH and its diametric opposition will be explored through some very illuminating articles and letters published by the newspapers. MIDLOTHIAN. LEITH was opposed to the idea, but was certainly not the only place involved. We will look at how the debate went in the Midlothian areas of Colinton, Corstorphine, Cramond and Liberton, who all joined as part of the expansion, and Musselburgh, who did not. Parliament. We will then look at how the debate went when the decision came before the House of Lords. We will look at after amalgamation and how things developed. Finally, rounding things off in a conclusion. I hope that you'll all still be with me by that point. Before we continue, I should offer a note on the terminologies that you'll hear. The boundary extension is referred to by the correspondents and letter writers of the time by names such as amalgamation, union, annexation, absorption, and others. It is my understanding that these terms are used interchangeably and without difference to their meaning in this context. The image that you have been looking at on this slide is of an engraving made in 1890 depicting the halfway house, which was halfway down Leith Walk at Pilrig. This was the boundary between Leith and Edinburgh when they were separate boroughs. The building was a coaching inn built in the 17th century and served as a rest stop on the regular coach service from Leith to Edinburgh. This building survived as a pub in truncated form until 1983. Greater Edinburgh. In the years leading up to the boundary change, we see a great deal of new ideas, speculation, and conjecture on what life in the future might look like. People at the time were dealing with the immediate post-war period and its reconstruction. As well, they were reeling from the aftermath of a deadly flu pandemic. Against this grim backdrop, people rightly looked to improve their lot. Government legislation was brought in requiring local authorities to improve the conditions of housing within their respective areas. Similar legislation was also passed about electricity provision and public health too. The Edinburgh Boundary Extension Act put forward the position that due to the tight post-war purse strings, one larger administration having greater control of affairs such as house building and utility provision would be better placed to tackle these big expensive issues when considering things at scale. Glasgow, Dundee, Birmingham and a host of other UK cities had in the preceding years set a blueprint for a large population centre to come into the control of one unitary authority. In some ways, Edinburgh was just looking to follow suit, though it had already embarked on many improvement schemes previously at various points during the 19th and early 20th centuries. This proposal caused controversy, however, in that it sought wholesale to bring entire parishes within the city's control for the first time. On the screen here, we see a map of the Edinburgh and District Waterworks from 1890. The map shows the Pentland and Moorfoot reservoirs to the south of Edinburgh and the lines of the pipes taking waters into the city. The water supply company took the form of a junked board, which is something we will have a look at in more detail later. Firstly though, let us turn to the full title of the bill and later Act of Parliament was the Edinburgh Boundary and Tramways Extension. Apart from housing conditions, transport was an extremely important and central issue to people at the time. Edinburgh Council took full control of the tram network in 1919 when the private business that had been running it along with the authorities' lease ran out. This was met with great celebration. The Musselburgh News described it as the birth of a new venture, and we trust the beginning of a new and prosperous era, for unlike some government concerns, tramways, electric light and gas undertakings have proved to be extremely remunerative in the interest of the communities. Now that the private company's lease is ended, the ratepayers know that the tramways are their own, and no doubt the councillors will hear about it if developments in the direction of improvement are delayed. Fast forward 100 years and we are still letting our councillors in Edinburgh know about how the tram service should be improved. Not all were happy at this development, however. Have a look here at the words of a concerned cab driver who wrote to the Edinburgh Evening News using the slightly unimaginative pen name Taxi. Does the tramway manager's scheme entail the removal of the present Princes Street cab stands? If so, we would like to make it clear to the corporation and their latest officials that any interference here will be opposed by the sub-owners, using this stance to the utmost limit and to the last farthing. For over 100 years there has been an established hackney carriage on Princes Street, and for sedan chairs before them, long before any fixed tramway was thought of. The cab owners have as good a right to pay and ply for their hire on Edinburgh streets as any corporation tramway, and cab hiring public have as good a right to be considered as the tramway patronisers. To which the Evening News replied that the full particulars of the scheme were available for viewing at the Employment Exchange, Toll Cross. Moving on, but staying with mass transport. Apologies to all of you for the poor choice of pun in the title of this slide. But for those of you that don't know what I mean, the image that you can see is, again, Leith Walk at Pilrig Street. Pilrig was the approximate boundary of Leith and Edinburgh. There were two separate tram systems in place, and anyone who wanted to travel either way past Pilrig had to change here. The connection of the two systems was known locally as the Pilrig MUDDLE. Edinburgh ran a cable conduit system since 1899, whereas Leith had electric since 1905. This photograph shows an Edinburgh cable tram reaching the boundary, and there are no overhead wires in place for the Leith system. So it must have been taken between 1899 and early 1905. Overall, the tram network in Edinburgh was in need of updating and modernisation. A scan of the newspapers from the time reveals a long list of people who wrote in to say exactly that. The corporation had taken note, however, as many improvements and modifications were proposed as part of the Boundary Extension merger, including new lines which would connect villages such as Collington in MIDLOTHIAN for the first time. Despite Leith's advanced system, they still had transport problems of their own. The following letter states an issue with a different form of traffic. This comes from the Leith Observer in October of 1919. Sir, is it not possible to instruct some of our policemen in the art of directing traffic, especially at the foot of Leith Walk? The traffic in Leith seems to take care of itself. This, in such a busy town, is not what should obtain. The traffic at the foot of the walk is enormous, and the wonder is that there is not accidents more frequently, or indeed there have been accidents, although not serious. Motors, motorbikes, and pushbikes whiz past one in an incredible number and at incredible speed, and yet there is no attempt at regulation. Certain men in blue ought to be trained in this branch of their calling and appointed to this particular duty. Why, even Edinburgh is ahead of us in this important matter. I hope this will meet the eye of the person, or persons, whose duty it is to safeguard in a reasonable and adequate way the lives of the lieges. Yours, etc., Anxious. I promised earlier that we will not shy away from the controversy for too long, and instead plough right in head first. By this I of course mean the contentious issue of Leith. As we know, amalgamation was vehemently opposed by Leith Town Council as soon as the Edinburgh Corporation had put the idea forward. The Scotsman described the situation like so in their article from Friday the 1st of August 1919. Leith has answered Edinburgh's advances with a view to a union by turning her back on her suitor. If the Town Council correctly interpret her attitude and feelings, she declines even to discuss or consider the question of amalgamation. The line that has been taken by the neighbouring borough may be unwise, but it is not unnatural, nor is it expected. Leith has a good deal to forget, and perhaps to forgive. She cannot put old wrongs, real or imagined, immediately out of her head, or reconcile herself offhand to contemplating the surrender of her independent existence. The grudges of the past seem to weigh with her more than the necessities of the present, or the requirements of the coming time. The Scotsman newspaper there, nailing its colours to the wall in favour of amalgamation. What I find interesting from this writing, though it was certainly a convention of the time, is in how LEITH is described continually with she and her pronouns. Indeed, further to that, LEITH is often depicted as being a female who has an unwanted suitor asking for her hand in marriage. This, as we shall see later on, is not the only time these events were portrayed in this way. So how did LEITH resolve to argue against the case put forward by Edinburgh? To answer this, we turn back to the Scotsman. It is in effect acknowledged by LEITH that the affairs of Edinburgh and LEITH are so intermixed, especially with regard to the administration of the great commercial undertakings. The solution suggested, then, is an extension of the device of joint boards, with the necessary accompaniment of a lowering of the democratic character and popular control of the local administration in the two communities. The editor of the Scotsman, not shy from showing his opinion on what the proposal was. He says, "This was in place of an honourable and stable union. What is hinted at is something of the nature of a left-handed alliance. The dilution of power and control from the centre would never do for that particular editor." The photograph on this page is of LEITH Town Hall on the corner of Constitution Street and Queen Charlotte Street. This building was designed by R&R Dixon and built between 1927 and 1928. This is now the LEITH Police Station. Unfortunately, there isn't time in this talk to examine the entire history of relations between Edinburgh and LEITH. To put it mildly, it goes back a long way and is very checkered. If you are interested in this history, I would highly recommend the series of articles penned by Edinburgh councillor John Harrison for the Scotsman during 1919, of which you can see a snippet of the first one on the left side of the screen currently. To summarise just some of this history, however, LEITH had been dependent and independent of Edinburgh at various points from the 13th century onwards. Mary Queen of Scots, who you can see pictured here, was a great champion of LEITH, but in also needing to raise money for a war, effectively sold the port to Edinburgh for £5,000 Scots. It was at this point that Edinburgh then imposed very heavy taxes and burdens upon the merchants from the port, leading to a great deal of ill feeling that carried on through the decades. LEITH remained part of Edinburgh from this time until it again won its independence due to the passing of the Boroughs Act of 1834, which then gave it equal status to its neighbour. For whatever reasons, the people of LEITH felt there were huge differences, perhaps owing to either these historical gripes, or perhaps just as Councillor Harrison puts it, Edinburgh being a town of professional men and shopkeepers, and LEITH of merchant and manufacturers. The councillor in his articles makes further points when he says, "Looking at a strip of land only 4 miles across and with a population of just over 400,000 supporting 2 town councils, 2 school boards, a gas commission, a purification commission for the tiny stream which drains into the district. Each of these bodies has a clerk and a treasurer, and a host of officials who are far too dignified to communicate with one another save by letter, and each one of whom has to assert his authority against the universe. Yet, the people of this district have a common origin, and share in a history that is common to both. Commercial interests, the requirements of good municipal government, cry out for a union between the city and the town, and nothing stands in the way of union except the recollection of old quarrels. As we have seen previously, newspapers took an ideological standpoint on the issue. It is illuminating, though, that a notable councillor makes their case by writing directly and at such length. A final point on LEITH's history with relations in Edinburgh is that a case was put forward in 1894 for amalgamation, and this was rejected. This, of course, was in most people's memories still when 1920 came around. Town council elections took place at a key time in the Extension Act debate. The following article from the LEITH Observer shows the strength of feeling put forward to the voter to choose candidates who were against the Extension Act. Every vote that is not given on Tuesday to a declared and staunch anti-amalgamationist is a vote for Edinburgh. Let there be no mistake about the position at the present time. LEITH is in great danger of losing its hard-won independence. Edinburgh has now declared its intention of proceeding with a provisional order to obtain powers to draw into its voracious maw the borough of LEITH, the borough of Musselburgh, and a large part of the county of Midlothian. Musselburgh and Midlothian will no doubt look after themselves. We are now concerned with LEITH, and we ask all the voters on Tuesday to seriously consider the state of the matters. There should be no weakening of the line, no parleying with the weak-willed and supine, and no bowing down to the Moloch that seeks to devour us. Fantastic words from the LEITH Observer there. The article continues in that fashion and is one of many printed in the papers from that time. The article we are reading from goes on to profile each candidate who was standing for election and which side of the boundary fence they sat on. Following the elections, famously a plebiscite was proposed by the LEITH Observer and quickly adopted, later that week in fact, by the town council. Unusually, this took the form of a card plebiscite which was sent to the homes of LEITH residents along with a manifesto in which notable politicians and figures from industry in LEITH encouraged voters to return the card with a no vote. The results came out heavily in favour of LEITH remaining an independent borough, with a huge 29,891 against amalgamation, with only 5,357 for. LEITH at this time would have had a population of around 39,000, which makes the turnout well over 91%. The article you can see on the screen at the moment there is also from the LEITH Observer, and they are encouraging Edinburgh to also hold a plebiscite on amalgamation. I won't read that one, but I'd like to draw your attention to the last few lines if you can read those. Some have asked the question in the run-up to this boundary change centennial, what would happen if the plebiscite was run again? I will just leave that there for your consideration. The Midlothian County Council did not have the same objections as LEITH. Colinton, Corstorphine, Cramond and Liberton were all Midlothian areas and part of the proposals for amalgamation. Councillor Young writes in the Midlothian Journal, Friday the 28th of November 1919, his reasons for wanting the amalgamation. He states that the City of Edinburgh imposes standards on housing. Although there is some agricultural land, all of the places proposed are really suburbs of the city already, with most of the inhabitants working and setting off to Edinburgh each day. Like with housing, there are many industries popping up all over the place, and these should be brought up to the city's standards also. The proposal takes takes in whole parishes, including all administration and responsibility, which will give efficiency, less to pay if there is one administrator for electricity, gas and water supplies. If the water supply in one area is to be extended, then the cost will be less felt by all if spread across a much wider area. Councillor Young continues, the joint boards are not advantageous to the city as they are effectively a private-run concern. Often, the partnerships were split heavily against Edinburgh in how they were funded. Councillor Young then goes on to ask the question, who can tell where LEITH ends and Edinburgh begins these days? Musselburgh is supported by the town council there, and they see a greater opportunity for a greater pool of resources to use for the benefit of the area. I cannot find in my research so far that many examples of ordinary residents of Midlothian who opposed the Act. It is true that a great number of them worked within Edinburgh and probably relished the idea of better transport links and council services. Scanning the letters pages of local newspapers from Midlothian didn't uncover that much of the debate there. That is not to say that the editors and feature writers from those papers did not cover the story, as they did and in great length. The Musselburgh News and the Midlothian Journal fairly quickly became supporters of the process, as did Musselburgh Town Council and, a time later, Midlothian County Council. This was not always the case. Both of these authorities initially opposed the decision, but then later came out in support. Notable figures on the Midlothian Council of the time included Sir John Usher and Don John Wauchope of Edmundston. Another notable opposer of the bill was the Duke of Buccleuch, who stated that the Granton Harbour was his by feudal right. Another area of objection that was later dropped was from Midlothian Education Authority, who stated that their excellent educational buildings would be lost in the transfer to Edinburgh. Dalkeith Town Council were encouraged by the editor of the Dalkeith Advertiser to keep a close and careful watch on the situation. They say, this extension of bounds will entail a considerable change in the present arrangements and will include the present water supply and possible gas and electric powers. With control of the road traffic and regulations affecting these matters, it would be well for the Town Council of Dalkeith to keep their eyes open to possible changes, which may or may not be to the advantage of the inhabitants. When considering the opposition in Midlothian as a whole, it did attract a lot. The way in which a lot of it was dropped, though, seems to have been through negotiation with the Edinburgh Corporation. Parliament. The bill went to Parliament in December 1919, initially with 35 petitions of opposition. By the time it was heard at the House of Lords in late April and early May of the following year, 1920, all of these oppositions had been dropped, barring LEITH Town Council. For reasons unclear, Musselburgh was dropped from the bill, though this was probably due to them not wanting to split up the historic parish of Inveresk. LEITH councillors were valiant in their opposition to the very last, but did not take the decision well. The Lords Committee said that after the first day of hearing that unless they had further different arguments than the ones that had already been presented, they should seek to open negotiations with Edinburgh and make the best terms that they can. LEITH, however, declined this suggestion. The Scotsman described the Town Council's position as impossible. by fighting a forlorn hope to the last ditch that they would incur an unjustifiable waste of public money. The representatives of LEITH have prided themselves that they are businessmen. In that capacity, if no other, it should be clear now to them that their civic motto is persevere. It is not a virtue any longer in this case. A particularly damaging claim put forward during the hearing by Edinburgh Town Council was that many prominent and notable men of LEITH were actually residents of Edinburgh and enjoyed the amenities it provided, such as libraries and a theatre, while ordinary Leithers were denied by their own town council the investment to create the same for themselves. A list was drawn up by Edinburgh of the names and addresses of 128 merchants of LEITH who were resident in Edinburgh to reinforce this point. The boundary change was the most single significant expansion in Edinburgh's history. Overnight, the city grew from 17 square miles to over 53 square miles and expanded its population by nearly a third, from 320,000 to over 425,000. Edinburgh Town Council committed in their proposal to investing in the amalgamated areas to bring them up to a common standard across the city. This included standardised lighting, a new public hall for LEITH, bowling greens for Corstorphine and Liberton, park improvements for LEITH and Colinton, and new gymnasia throughout all of the amalgamated areas. On the matter of housing, 5 different area-based improvement schemes were promoted for localities within the city's newly extended boundaries. This saw nearly 4,000 substandard dwellings improved. In 1927, a major sanitation improvement scheme known as the Canongate Corstorphine scheme was promoted to carry out improvement work in 6 different parts of the city. And though it took some time, LEITH finally got its own library, which opened in 1929. The first electric tram to run straight through Pilrig operated in June 1922, and the last cable-hauled tram anywhere on the network finished a year later. The promised new routes took some time, but then went on to include Gorgie to Stenhouse, which opened in 1930, Braids to Fairmile Head in 1936, and North Gyle to Maybury a year later. The image that you can see on the screen is from the evening news of a worker making a repair to a tram track. They say, "In these days of scarcity and high prices, the rail is not taken up but merely patched. In other words, the hollow rail is built up with molten steel, and the photograph shows the welder at work protected by a heavy screen. Make do and mend." So what can we say in a way of conclusion to this talk here? Whilst attempting to tell the broad story of events leading up to the boundary extension and its aftermath, I hope that I have been able to bring alive some of the voices from the time also. Although this is designed to be a short talk, I think we have seen how newspapers of the time were either ardent amalgamationists or quite the opposite. There doesn't seem to be a middle ground in the way that this issue was reported back then. These were very entrenched standpoints taken up by the papers, but that didn't stop the opposing voices being heard within the same publication. For example, the article snippet on the left side of the screen here is the letter sent to the Evening News and talks strongly of how LEITH should remain independent. When I set out upon the initial research for this talk, I imagined that I would have uncovered a great deal of personal opinion on the topic, and this was definitely the case. What was a discovery for me was in how we have seen councillors and other politicians directly put across their position on issues, and that style of writing, which is both at length and direct, I think is unusual in today's political reporting, certainly at a local level. Newspapers are as a fantastic tool for research and finding out about the past, discovering what was written and how that compares with the sensitivities of a reader looking back from our times. I hope you have been presented with some facts and information here which may influence your thinking on the question, was the boundary extension a good thing? As I said at the outset, the previous talk from the ReDrawing Edinburgh series is on the Edinburgh City Archives Facebook page. The next one that's coming up is based on maps and images from the time and how they were utilised in particular by the authorities to show their side of the arguments when it came towards the boundary proposals. That talk will be on Monday the 17th of August, probably around this same time of the evening, but we will officially advertise for that in the coming days. The ReDrawing Edinburgh project is a combined effort between various City of Edinburgh Council departments and with community group involvement, and although understandably events have been limited to online only for this initial part of the commemoration, the plans from September onwards are hoping to include physical activities too. So please do keep an eye on the project between now and the end of the year. If anyone is interested for a full list or further reading list of newspapers and articles that we used here, please send me an email at central.edsc.library@edinburgh.gov.uk where I can get back to you. I should also mention that we run an inquiry service for local and family history from the Edinburgh and Scottish Collection email address that you can see on screen. If you have any questions relating to the history of Edinburgh, its people, or indeed wider afield in Scotland, we are quite experienced in family history and local area research, so please do drop us a line and we will do our best to help out. That's all from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be available in the chat for the next 10 minutes or so if you want to ask any questions. Many thanks. Bye bye.